Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're embarking on an extraordinary journey, diving deep into the earliest written records of human civilization. These aren't just ancient texts, they're humanity's first attempts to understand existence itself, carved into clay tablets long before the Egyptian pyramids ever touched the sky, before the Sphinx gazed across the desert sands, before anything we typically associate with ancient civilization had even begun. Before we start this exploration together, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe, but only if this content genuinely resonates with you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something truly remarkable about connecting with people across continents, all of us drawn to the same ancient questions about our origins and what our ancestors truly understood. Get comfortable now. Dim those lights, maybe turn on some white noise in the background, and let's explore what the Sumerian tablets actually tell us. Not what modern interpreters want them to say, but what they reveal in their own voice, through their own symbols, before Zecharia Sitchin and the History Channel told us how to think about ancient gods from the stars. Part 1. The Waters Before Creation. Our story doesn't begin with spacecraft descending from distant planets. It doesn't start with genetic laboratories or extraterrestrial mining operations. None of the sensational imagery that has captured modern imagination appears in these ancient sources. Instead, the Sumerian creation narrative opens with something far more primal and profound: Nammu. Nammu wasn't a goddess in the way we typically imagine deities today, not a being with human form walking among mortals, not a personality with preferences and emotions you could relate to. Nammu represented something more fundamental, more elemental, the primordial ocean. The cosmic sea existing before creation itself had meaning or form. To truly understand this concept, we need to understand the Sumerian relationship with water. These people settled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in flat alluvial plains where survival depended entirely on annual flooding. When the rivers flooded properly, depositing rich silt across the fields, harvests were abundant and cities prospered. When floods came at the wrong time or with wrong intensity, famine threatened and survival became uncertain. Water was life itself to the Sumerians, not metaphorically but literally in the most tangible sense imaginable. So when they contemplated the origins of everything, they naturally conceived of water as the primal element, the creative matrix from which all existence emerged. Imagine not the emptiness of space as we understand it today with our telescopes and satellites, but emptiness existing before space itself, before dimensions, before up and down and left and right had any meaning. This was what the Sumerians attempted to describe with Nammu, a nothingness that simultaneously contained everything, a cosmic ocean holding all potential but manifesting nothing, suspended in timeless waiting. The cuneiform tablets from Nippur, that sacred city in central Iraq, preserved texts dating to around 1600 BCE but recording oral traditions thousands of years older. These sources describe Nammu as a self-generating creative force, a deity requiring no partner or consort to bring forth the universe. This detail carries profound significance when we compare Sumerian cosmology to creation myths of other ancient cultures. In most mythologies, creation requires divine marriage, a union of opposites producing something new. The Sky Father mates with Earth Mother, and from their union comes the world. But the earliest Sumerian tradition described something different. Nammu was complete unto herself, containing both creative potential and the will to actualize it. She was, in the truest sense, the creatrix before the categories of male and female had been established, before the principle of duality had entered the cosmos. Some scholars have suggested that Nammu represents a memory of an earlier religious tradition in Mesopotamia, perhaps one predating Sumerian civilization itself, a tradition emphasizing female creative power and seeing the cosmos emerging from a single divine source rather than from the union of opposites. The first generation, heaven and earth unite. From her own essence, Nammu brought forth two beings, An representing the sky, the vast celestial dome covering the earth like an inverted bowl, and Kai embodying the earth itself, the solid foundation for all terrestrial life. These weren't fully anthropomorphic gods, with human faces and recognizable emotions. They were fundamental forces of nature, given divine status, cosmic principles personified, the basic architecture of reality itself taking its first form. Initially, Anunnaki existed in a state of unity, locked together in undifferentiated mass, in eternal embrace. The tablets describe this primordial union using language suggesting both physical proximity and metaphysical identity. There was no space between heaven and earth, no atmosphere, no realm where life could exist. Everything that would later fill the cosmos existed only as potential within this unified mass, waiting for the force that would separate them and create the space where existence could flourish. From the union of An and Ki, from the joining of heaven and earth in that primordial state before separation, came Enlil, whose name translates approximately as Lord of the Air, or Master of Breath. Enlil's role in shaping the cosmos, as we know it, was absolutely fundamental, and necessarily violent. Creation couldn't proceed through gentle evolution or gradual development. It required rupture, a forceful breaking apart, a violent separation of what had been unified. Enlil thrust the sky upward, pushing An away from Ki, and in that violent act created the space between them, the air, the atmosphere, the realm where weather happens and birds fly and humans breathe. This act of separation was the true beginning of the ordered cosmos, the moment when potential became actual, when undifferentiated unity gave way to the multiplicity and diversity we experience as reality. An was carried away to the heavens, rising upward to establish his domain in the celestial realm far above Earth. Ki remained below as the foundation of the manifest world, and Enlil claimed the space between them, the air, the wind, the breath of life itself, as his particular kingdom, the realm he would rule over and protect. This three-tiered structure, heaven, earth, and the air between, formed the fundamental cosmological framework of Sumerian thought. Simple in some respects, yet capturing something essential about the observable world, the unreachable sky above, home to sun, moon, and stars that govern time and seasons. The earth below, realm of human activity and agricultural labour, and the invisible but essential air between, the medium through which rain falls and breath moves. The time before time. But here's where the texts reveal something absolutely fascinating about the Sumerian understanding of time and creation. They describe a period before Enlil's separation, a time the Sumerians themselves struggled to articulate, a period for which they lacked adequate vocabulary or conceptual frameworks. The tablets speak of a time when only water existed, when boundaries between salt water and fresh water hadn't been established, when the cosmic ocean was undifferentiated and all-encompassing, without division into the rivers that flowed from mountains and the sea that received them. In later Babylonian texts, particularly the famous Enuma Elish, composed perhaps 1,000 years after the earliest Sumerian narratives, this primordial water split into two distinct beings. Apsu, representing fresh underground water emerging in springs and wells, and Tiamat, embodying the salt water of the sea, the vast ocean surrounding the known world. Their mingling, the mixing of fresh and salt water, produced the first generation of gods in Babylonian tradition. But in the older Sumerian tradition, predating these Babylonian elaborations, Nammu preceded even this division. She was the totality of primordial waters, before any distinction had been made, before the categories structuring later cosmological thinking had been established. This suggests that Sumerian creation mythology, at least in its earliest forms, was more monistic than later Babylonian versions, seeing ultimate reality as emerging from a single source rather than from dualistic interaction. Eridu, the first city and the sacred geography. Archaeological evidence from excavations conducted over the past century and a half supports the profound antiquity of these beliefs and their connection to real geographical locations in ancient Mesopotamia. The city of Eridu, located in southern Iraq, near what was once the shoreline of the Persian Gulf, but which is now many miles inland due to millennia of sediment deposition, was considered by the Sumerians themselves as the oldest city in the world, the first place where kingship descended from heaven, the birthplace of civilization itself. Modern excavations conducted by Iraqi and international archaeological teams have confirmed that Eridu indeed represents one of the earliest urban settlements in human history, with occupation levels dating back to approximately 5400 BCE, making it contemporary with, or even slightly older than, the famous site of Uruk to the north. The patron deity of Eridu was Enki, also known by the Akkadian name Ea in later Semitic-speaking periods of Mesopotamian history. God of wisdom, of fresh water that flowed beneath the earth and emerged in springs, of creation and crafts and magical knowledge. Enki occupied a special place in the Sumerian pantheon, often portrayed as cleverer than other gods, more willing to help humanity, less bound by rigid hierarchies and protocols governing divine society. He was, in some respects, a trickster figure, a subversive force who worked around the decrees of more powerful but less imaginative gods to achieve what he believed to be just or necessary outcomes. Enki's temple at Eridu bore the name Abzu, literally translating as House of the Cosmic Deep Waters, or Temple of the Primordial Ocean. This wasn't merely poetic symbolism or a metaphorical designation. The temple was believed to be built upon the very spot where the primordial waters of the Abzu first emerged into the terrestrial world, where the boundary between the cosmic ocean existing beneath all land and the realm of human habitation was thinnest and most permeable. Priests conducting rituals in this temple, performing daily services to the god, making offerings and reciting hymns in the ancient Sumerian language, believed they were standing at nothing less than the axis of creation, the point where the ordered world of cities and agriculture and civilization touched the primal chaos that had preceded it, and that still existed beneath the thin veneer of order. The significance of this location and this belief system cannot be overstated when we're trying to understand Sumerian cosmology and its relationship to the physical landscape in which these people lived. The Abzu, the cosmic ocean below, these ancient Sumerians living over 5,000 years ago in a time when writing was still a recent invention and cities were a relatively new form of human organization, conceived of their world as resting upon and emerging from a cosmic ocean of fresh water. This wasn't abstract theology disconnected from observable reality. It was grounded in actual environmental experience. Below the earth, they believed, stretched the Abzu, an endless expanse of subterranean waters from which all springs, rivers, and wells ultimately flowed. When they dug wells to reach water for drinking and irrigation, when they observed springs bubbling up from beneath the ground, when they traced rivers back to their sources in the mountains and imagined what lay beneath those sources. They envisioned this cosmic ocean, infinite and primordial, the same waters that had existed before creation itself. This wasn't merely poetic metaphor or symbolic thinking, though it certainly had those dimensions. The Mesopotamian plain is characterized by a remarkably high water table, and the Sumerians observed through direct experience that when they dug deep enough anywhere in their territory, they invariably found water. From this observation, from this consistent empirical experience repeated countless times across generations, they constructed a cosmology in which the entire world floated upon or was surrounded by primordial waters, in which the dry land of Earth was essentially an island or a bubble in an infinite ocean. The sky above was conceived as a solid dome, perhaps made of some crystalline substance, arching over Earth and keeping the waters above from falling down and drowning the world. Below Earth were the waters of the Abzu, held back by the solid foundation of the world, but always present, always threatening to break through if the cosmic order failed. This cosmological model made profound sense given the Sumerian experience of floods, particularly the catastrophic inundations that could occur when the Tigris and Euphrates rivers overflowed their banks simultaneously, transforming the flat plains into an inland sea. During such floods, well documented in ancient texts and traceable in archaeological layers at multiple Mesopotamian sites, the world quite literally returned to a watery state, with only the raised hills where cities stood remaining above the floodwaters. The Sumerian flood myth, which we'll examine in extensive detail later, preserved the traumatic memory of such catastrophic events, elevated to cosmic and theological significance. The divine generations proliferate. The texts preserved in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, a magnificent scholarly resource created by researchers at Oxford University that makes thousands of Sumerian compositions available in English translation for anyone to read and study, provide remarkably detailed descriptions of the early cosmic order and the generations of gods who populated it. They speak of a time when gods themselves were born into this newly ordered world, when the divine pantheon began taking shape through divine births and sexual unions, when the empty spaces created by Enlil's separation of heaven and earth began filling with divine inhabitants, each with their own domains and responsibilities. But here's where the timeline becomes absolutely crucial for understanding what came before the Anunnaki narrative as it's understood in modern popular culture. The Anunnaki, according to actual Sumerian texts, when we read them carefully in their original language or in responsible scholarly translations, were not the first gods by any stretch of the imagination. They weren't even the second generation of deities. They appear relatively late in divine genealogy, as offspring of already established gods, members of the third or fourth generation, depending on how we count the generations starting from Nammu. The word Anunnaki itself, contrary to popular modern interpretations promoted by ancient astronaut theorists and their many followers, does not mean those who came down from heaven to earth, or those who from heaven came. This translation, which has become almost canonical in pseudo-archaeological circles, is simply incorrect. It represents either a misunderstanding of Sumerian grammar and etymology, or a deliberate mistranslation designed to support a predetermined conclusion about ancient astronauts. The term actually derives from Sumerian elements, translating more accurately as princely blood, seed of An, or offspring of the prince, referring to their status as descendants of An, the sky god whose name literally means heaven itself. Every reputable Sumerian dictionary, every scholarly analysis of the term, every expert who has devoted their career to understanding this ancient language confirms this etymological derivation. The Anunnaki were understood in Sumerian texts as a group of deities, powerful gods certainly, but gods who emerged from the cosmological framework that already existed, who were born into a divine hierarchy predating them by at least 2 generations. They were the children and grandchildren of the primordial deities, not the primordial deities themselves. The early pantheon, gods before the Anunnaki. Before the Anunnaki entered mythological narrative in their later well-defined roles, the texts describe a world populated by other divine beings, gods emerging directly from the primordial state, who established the fundamental patterns of existence. The earliest gods included not just An, Ki, and Enlil, whom we've already discussed, but also Nanna, later known as Sin in Akkadian tradition, the moon god, whose monthly cycle governed the Mesopotamian calendar, and whose temple at Ur was one of the most important religious centres in ancient Sumer. The moon's phases provided the basis for tracking time, and Nanna was revered as the measurer of days and months, the divine timekeeper, whose celestial movements organised human activity. Utu, Shamash in Akkadian, the sun god who brought light and warmth to the world, associated with justice and truth because the sun's light revealed everything hidden, exposing secrets and lies. His daily journey across the sky marked the passage of time, and his penetrating rays symbolised divine judgment that saw all and judged fairly. Inanna, Ishtar in Akkadian, perhaps the most complex and fascinating goddess in the entire pantheon, deity of love and warfare, fertility and destruction, the planet Venus, whose appearance as both morning and evening star made her seem like 2 different entities. Inanna embodied the fundamental Sumerian understanding that creation and destruction were intimately linked, that life and death were 2 faces of the same cosmic reality, that the forces generating life were also capable of bringing death. Nin-Hursag, also known as Ninmah, Nintu, and by many other names, the great mother goddess associated with birth, fertility, and the nurturing of life. She played crucial roles in creation narratives, working alongside Enki to fashion humanity and to resolve problems that arose in the early world. These deities, along with many others whose names fill surviving god lists and hymns, established the fundamental patterns of existence long before the Anunnaki appeared as a distinct group. They created the cycles of day and night through celestial movements. They established seasons through annual flooding and stellar movements. They governed natural phenomena upon which Sumerian life absolutely depended. Rain falling from clouds, storms that could destroy crops or buildings, gentle breezes providing relief from summer heat. Part 2. The Antediluvian Age. The Sumerian King List, one of the most fascinating and puzzling documents to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, provides an intriguing window into the period before familiar historical narrative begins, before we can match names in texts with archaeological evidence, before the reigns of kings can be correlated with artifacts and inscriptions. This ancient document, composed during the 3rd dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, but drawing on much older sources preserved in temple archives and oral traditions, begins with a remarkable statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This opening formula establishes kingship itself, centralized political authority exercised by a single ruler, as a divine institution rather than human invention. Kingship didn't emerge from social contracts or political agreements among early humans. It didn't develop gradually through evolution of tribal leadership. It descended from heaven, was given as a gift from the gods to humanity, appeared fully formed as a divinely ordained system of governance. But then, after establishing this theological principle about the divine origins of kingship, the Sumerian king list does something absolutely extraordinary that has puzzled and fascinated scholars since the document was first discovered and translated. It names 8 kings who ruled before the Great Flood, antediluvian rulers whose reigns stretched across seemingly impossible spans of time that dwarf even the exaggerated chronologies we find in other ancient king lists. These 8 rulers governed 5 cities in succession: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, and their combined reigns totaled an astonishing 200 years according to the traditional, interpretation of the Sumerian sexagesimal numerical system. The first of these antediluvian kings, a figure named Allulim, who ruled in the sacred city of Eridu, reigned for 2,800 years. Just try to wrap your mind around that number for a moment. 2,800 years is longer than all recorded human history, from the earliest Sumerian texts to the present day. It's longer than the entire period of human agriculture, longer than the existence of any city or civilization we know about. His successor, Alalgar, reigned for 36,000 years, an even more astronomical figure. The third king, Enmenluana, ruled for 43,200 years. Interpreting the impossible numbers, modern scholars have naturally struggled to make sense of these numbers, which seem to exist beyond any reasonable interpretation as actual chronological data. Some have suggested they should be understood symbolically rather than literally, that they represent qualities or achievements rather than years, that they encode theological or cosmological information in numerical form. Others have proposed that the term we translate as year might have represented a different unit of time in the original context, perhaps a month or even a day, which would reduce these reigns to more reasonable lengths when recalculated. If we divided 28,800 by 365, for instance, treating each unit as a day rather than a year, Allulim would have ruled for about 79 years, which is long but not impossible for a ruler. But there's another possibility that deserves serious consideration, one that the Sumerians themselves might have intended when they recorded these enormous numbers. These antediluvian rulers may have been understood as existing in a fundamentally different temporal framework than post-flood kings, as inhabiting a kind of mythological time that operated according to different principles than historical time. The Sumerian texts repeatedly emphasize a sharp distinction between the world before the flood and the world after it, treating them as fundamentally different epochs operating under different cosmic conditions. Before the deluge, the texts suggest through various subtle indicators and explicit statements the rules governing existence were different in ways we can barely comprehend from our perspective within historical time. Time itself flowed differently, not subject to the same constraints and limitations governing our experience. Life operated on different principles, with lifespans extended far beyond what would later become normal. The boundary between divine and mortal realms was less rigid, less absolute, more permeable, allowing for direct contact and interaction that would become increasingly rare in the post-flood world. These 8 antediluvian kings, whose names have been preserved across multiple versions of the king list discovered at different archaeological sites throughout Mesopotamia, may have been understood to represent a mythological age, a time when gods walked the earth more directly than in later periods, when the ordered cosmos was still new and fresh from creation, when the patterns of civilization were still being established and refined. The cities of the Golden Age consider the names themselves and what they might tell us. Allulim and Alalgar, the first 2 kings who ruled in Eridu, have names whose meanings are obscure in Sumerian, possibly suggesting their extreme antiquity, predating the standardization of divine and royal names that would come later. Enmenluana, Enmengalana, and the shepherd god Dumuzi ruled in Bad Tibera, the second of the antediluvian cities. The prefix Enmen in these names indicates priestly or divine status, suggesting these rulers were not ordinary mortals, but beings with special connections to the divine realm. Dumuzi's identification as a shepherd links him to pastoral activities, to the tending of flocks that was one of the earliest forms of wealth and sustenance in ancient Mesopotamia. This also connects him to the god Dumuzi, who became famous in later Sumerian mythology as the lover of Inanna, and who died and was resurrected in an annual cycle associated with agricultural seasons. Ensipa-Zidana ruled in Larak, the third antediluvian city, while Enmenduranna governed in Sipar, the fourth city. This last name bears intriguing similarities to the biblical Enoch, both in its sound and in later traditions that associated both figures with special wisdom and heavenly visions. Some scholars have suggested that Enmenduranna and Enoch might represent the same figure remembered in different cultural traditions, a king or sage who lived before the flood and who received special revelation from the gods. Finally, Ubatutu ruled in Shuruppak, the fifth and final antediluvian city. He is identified in other texts as the father of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah who survived the flood, making him the last king of the antediluvian world, the ruler whose reign ended with the cosmic catastrophe. The cities themselves carry deep significance beyond merely being geographical locations. Eridu, as we've already discussed extensively, was the first city, the place where civilization began, the location of Enki's temple built over the cosmic waters, representing the ideal city, the prototype from which all others derived. Bad Tibira, whose name translates approximately as Wall of the Copper Worker, or Fortress of the Metal Workers, was associated particularly with metallurgy and craft production, with the technological innovations that transformed human life. The discovery of metalworking, the ability to extract copper from ore and shape it into tools and weapons, represented a revolutionary development in human culture, and Bad Tibira embodied this transformation. Larak's significance is less clear from surviving texts, which mention it but don't elaborate on its particular character or patron deity. However, the city appears in various incantations and rituals associated with healing and purification, suggesting it may have been especially connected to these practices. Sipar was sacred to Utu, the sun god associated with justice and truth and light, and it housed one of the most important temples in all ancient Mesopotamia, a centre of learning and law, where scribes were trained and legal decisions were made. The city became synonymous with justice and scholarship, with the illumination that dispels ignorance just as the sun dispels darkness. Shuruppak, the final antediluvian city, would become famous in later tradition as the home of Ziusudra and as the city where the flood began, the last city to exist before the cosmic catastrophe that ended the antediluvian world. What the antediluvian period represents. What do these cities and their impossibly long-reigning kings tell us about the Sumerian understanding of prehistory, of the period before historical memory reaches? They suggest a graduated cosmology, a sophisticated view of time and existence that moved from the purely divine realm through intermediate stages toward the fully human world that the Sumerians inhabited. The antediluvian period represented a time when gods and humans, or perhaps better to say godlike beings and human-like beings, existed in much closer proximity than would later be possible. Kingship had descended from heaven, meaning that rulership itself was understood as divine gift and sacred responsibility. But the kings who exercised this heavenly gift in the earliest times were not fully human in the way that later rulers would be. They were transitional figures, existing at the boundary between divine and mortal, partaking of both natures, able to live for thousands of years because they possessed divine qualities that ordinary humans lacked. Their extreme lifespans marked them as exceptional, as fundamentally different from the post-flood kings who would come after them, as belonging to a different order of being. This is mythological thinking in its purest form, using chronology and genealogy to express theological and cosmological ideas, to trace the gradual movement from the divine to the human, from the eternal to the temporal, from myth to history. The Sumerian texts make abundantly clear, when we read them carefully and in proper context, that these antediluvian rulers existed before what we might call the Anunnaki narrative proper, before the stories of divine councils making decisions about humanity's fate, before the tales of gods complaining about human noise, and deciding to send a flood to reduce the population. This chronological distinction is absolutely crucial for understanding what the texts actually say versus what modern interpreters claim they say. Part 3. The creation of humanity. A crucial Sumerian text called Enki and Ninmah provides detailed information about humanity's creation. Information that predates and provides essential context for any later stories about the Anunnaki's involvement with human beings. This remarkable composition describes a time when the gods, specifically the lesser or junior gods, who occupied the lower ranks of the divine hierarchy, were burdened with the back-breaking work of creation and cosmic maintenance. They dug canals to channel water for irrigation, ensuring that fields could be watered even when rains didn't come at the right time. They piled up silt to create foundations for temples and cities, building the platforms upon which civilization would literally rest. They crushed clay to make bricks for building, producing the fundamental building material of Mesopotamian architecture. They cleared fields, planted crops, tended herds, and performed all the countless tasks necessary to maintain the ordered cosmos. And they complained bitterly about their toil, about the endless labour that left them exhausted and miserable, about the drudgery that seemed to have no end. In those days, in the days when heaven and earth were created, the text begins with a formula establishing the deep antiquity of the events it describes. In those nights, in the nights when heaven and earth were created, in those years, in the years when the fates were determined, when the Inanna gods were born, when the goddesses were taken in marriage, when the goddesses were distributed in heaven and earth. This opening situates the story at the very beginning of cosmic time, immediately after the basic structure of reality had been established, but before the world had taken its final form. The senior gods, the great deities like An and Enlil, who held supreme positions in the divine hierarchy, oversaw the work while the minor gods bore the actual toil, performing the physical labour that the cosmic order required. This divine hierarchy, with its stark division between the gods who commanded and the gods who laboured, existed before humanity entered the picture, before humans had been created to serve any purpose whatsoever. The text tells us that Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water and creative problem-solving, lay sleeping in the deep waters of the Abzu, in the subterranean cosmic ocean that was his special domain, completely unaware of the complaints and suffering of the labouring gods. His mother Nammu, that primordial deity who had existed before creation itself, gathered the tears of these suffering divine beings, collected their complaints and their anguish, and brought them to her son, rousing him from his sleep in the depths to address this problem that threatened to disrupt the cosmic order. "Can you really lie there sleeping?" she asked him, "while the gods groan under their labour, while their tears fall uncollected, while cosmic order teeters on the edge of revolt?" Enki's ingenious solution. Enki's solution to this divine labour crisis was both ingenious and fateful. He proposed creating a substitute workforce, beings who would relieve the gods of their backbreaking labour, who would take over the agricultural and construction work that was necessary to maintain the cosmos, but that the gods found so burdensome. Working in collaboration with Nammu and with the birth goddess Ninmah, also known by the names Ninhursag and Nintu in different contexts and periods, Enki fashioned the first humans from clay taken from atop the Abzu, from the primordial waters themselves, from the same cosmic substance that had existed before creation. This detail about clay coming from the Abzu is profoundly significant for understanding what the Sumerians believed about human nature and human origins. Humanity, according to this creation account, was formed from the most primal substance available, from clay infused with the essence of the cosmic waters that predated all ordered existence. We were not made from some lesser or degraded material, not assembled from the corpses of defeated demons as in some other ancient Near Eastern creation myths, but crafted from the same primordial stuff from which the gods themselves had emerged. The birth goddesses, divine midwives skilled in the creation of life, nipped off portions of this sacred clay. And through a process the text describes in somewhat obscure terms involving divine spittle and perhaps blood, human beings came into existence. This creation narrative predates and provides essential context for any later stories about the Anunnaki's role in human affairs that appear in later texts or in modern interpretations. Before the Anunnaki were described in Zechariah, Sitchin's books, and the ancient astronaut theory as creating humans through genetic manipulation to mine gold, before the modern theories about slave species and DNA splicing and extraterrestrial intervention, there was this older and more authentic Sumerian tradition. Humanity was created for a specific purpose, certainly, but that purpose was agricultural labour and the maintenance of temples, not mining operations or resource extraction for alien overlords travelling from distant planets. The motivation was practical from the divine perspective, relieving the gods of work they found burdensome and allowing them to focus on higher pursuits more befitting their divine status. But the process was sacred, involving divine collaboration, primordial materials, and the transfer of something essential from the divine realm to the mortal sphere. Humans were formed from primordial clay mixed with divine essence, making them participants in both the earthly realm of matter and form and the cosmic realm of spirit and divinity. This dual nature, neither fully natural like animals nor fully divine like gods, would define humanity's special and often uncomfortable position in the Sumerian worldview. The divine contest and human diversity. The text of Enki and Ninmah continues with a curious and revealing episode that demonstrates the experimental nature of this early creation, showing the gods working through trial and error to discover the proper form and function for human beings. After successfully making functional humans who could perform the required agricultural labour, after demonstrating that this new solution to the divine labour problem actually worked, Enki and Ninmah engage in a contest, a divine competition where each tries to create beings with various deficiencies, unusual characteristics, or extreme features, challenging the other to find appropriate roles for them in society. Ninmah creates people who are blind, unable to see the work they're supposed to do. She creates people who are paralysed, unable to move their limbs to perform labour. She creates people who are born without the ability to control their bodily functions, who suffer from various conditions, making standard work impossible. Each creation presents a challenge to the divine plan for human utility. And Enki, demonstrating his characteristic wisdom and adaptability and compassion, finds appropriate roles for each of them in society, showing that even those who cannot perform standard agricultural labour have value and can contribute to the community in other ways. He assigns those with vision impairments to musical performance, where acute hearing compensates for lack of sight. He finds roles for those with mobility issues in activities that don't require physical labour. He demonstrates that a well-ordered society has places for everyone, regardless of their physical capabilities. Then Enki takes his turn, creating beings with his own peculiar characteristics. Strange entities that push the boundaries of what human means, and challenges Ninmah to care for them and find their place in the cosmic order. This story, strange and perhaps even disturbing to modern sensibilities that prefer creation narratives to describe perfect divine acts producing perfect results, actually addresses profound questions about disability, purpose, social inclusion, and the place of all humans in the cosmic order, not just those who are healthy and able-bodied. It reflects a theological worldview that didn't see creation as a single perfect act that produced an ideal final form, but as an ongoing process subject to adjustment and improvement, requiring experimentation and adaptation. It shows gods who are creative and adaptable, who learn and problem solve, who engage actively with creation rather than simply decreeing it into existence from a position of aloof omnipotence. This experimental, process-oriented approach to creation stands in stark contrast to the ancient astronaut interpretation typically portraying humanity's creation as deliberate genetic engineering carried out according to a predetermined plan, with specific goals and parameters clearly defined from the start. The Sumerian text presents something far more nuanced and sophisticated: divine craftsmanship, involving learning, trial and error, creative problem-solving, and ongoing refinement as the gods discovered what worked and what didn't in the complex project of creating beings capable of both, serving divine needs and living meaningful lives. The gifts of civilization. Another crucial text called The Debate Between Sheep and Grain provides additional context for understanding early human existence before civilization reached its developed form, before the gifts that would make urban life possible had been granted to humanity. This composition describes the world before agriculture had been established, before the domestication of animals had transformed human diet and economy, before the establishment of the productive economic systems that would characterize Sumerian cities and make them centers of wealth and power. In the beginning, the text tells us, the earth was barren, offering nothing to sustain human life, beyond what could be gathered from wild plants and hunted from wild animals. There was no grain growing in cultivated fields, no wheat or barley that could be harvested and ground into flour for bread. There were no sheep providing wool for clothing and milk for nourishment, no goats climbing the hills, no cattle pulling ploughs through rich earth. People went naked because they had no fibres to weave into cloth, no hides to tan into leather, no protection from sun and cold except what they could improvise from reeds and wild plants. They ate grass for nourishment like animals, chewing tough wild plants that filled their bellies, but provided little real sustenance, drinking water from ditches and streams without benefit of wells or irrigation systems. This was humanity in its most primitive state according to Sumerian understanding, before the gods had granted them the technologies and knowledge that would enable civilization. Humans existed, certainly, but they lived barely above the level of animals, without the tools and techniques that would allow them to transcend their natural limitations and create something new, something that had never existed before in the natural world. They had consciousness, presumably, the divine spark that distinguished them from mere animals, but they lacked the practical knowledge to use that consciousness effectively, to transform their environment and create abundance from scarcity. Then, according to the text, the gods Ashnan and Lahar, who personified grain and sheep respectively, were created specifically to provide sustenance for humanity, to lift humans from their primitive state and enable them to live more comfortably, more securely, more abundantly. These were gifts from the divine realm to the human world. Technologies, we might say today, though the Sumerians understood them as living beings imbued with divine essence, as gods in their own right, who chose to dwell among humans and provide for their needs. The establishment of agriculture, the cultivation of wheat and barley in organised fields, and the domestication of sheep and goats represented a transformation in human existence. A movement from a state of bare survival, in which every day was a struggle to find enough food to sustain life, to a condition of productive culture in which surpluses could be generated, stored, redistributed, supporting specialization of labor and the growth of cities. And this transformation, according to the Sumerian texts, when we read them attentively and in proper cultural context, occurred through divine intervention, through the deliberate choice of the gods to improve human conditions, to grant humans the knowledge and the resources they needed to build something approaching civilization. This wasn't biological evolution slowly changing human capabilities over millions of years. It was cultural development, the transmission of knowledge and technique from the divine realm to the mortal sphere, happening relatively quickly in cosmic time, if not in human time, transforming existence within a few generations. Enki and the World Order. The text known to modern scholars as Enki and the World Order provides an even broader and more comprehensive picture of how the cosmos was organized in this early period after creation but before the historical era that archaeology and epigraphy can document directly. According to this lengthy and complex composition, Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet water and creative ingenuity, surveyed the newly created world after the basic structure had been established, after heaven and earth had been separated and the gods had been born and humans had been created, and he recognized that proper management was essential. The cosmos, even though it had been created and ordered, required constant divine oversight and maintenance to avoid falling back into chaos and disorder. Reality was not self-sustaining. It needed active management, continuous attention, deliberate intervention to maintain the patterns that had been established at creation. So Enki, acting with the authority granted to him by the sky god, and with the cooperation of other major deities, assigned various gods to oversee different aspects of cosmic existence, creating what was essentially a divine bureaucracy with clear chains of command and areas of responsibility. One deity was given responsibility for the sweet waters that flowed from springs and ran in rivers, ensuring that irrigation systems would function properly, that drought wouldn't destroy crops, that the life-giving water would continue to flow from the mountains down to the plains where cities and fields depended on it. Another god oversaw crops and agriculture more generally, making sure that fields produced their yields in the proper season, that seeds germinated and plants grew and harvests came at the expected times according to the rhythms established at creation. Yet another divine being managed construction and building projects, overseeing the making of bricks and the raising of walls and the construction of temples that connected earth to heaven, that provided dwelling places for the gods in the mortal realm. Others controlled wildlife, keeping animals in their proper places and preventing them from overrunning human settlements or destroying the crops that fed cities. Domestic animals had their divine overseer, ensuring that flocks and herds thrived and multiplied, providing wool and milk and meat for human sustenance. Even the activities of women, particularly weaving and spinning and the making of cloth, those essential crafts that transformed raw materials into the textiles necessary for clothing and trade, had a goddess assigned to supervise and protect them, to ensure that this vital work continued uninterrupted. This elaborate text reveals a Sumerian understanding of the world as requiring constant divine maintenance rather than operating automatically once it had been set in motion. The cosmos, in Sumerian thought, didn't simply run on autopilot after creation had been completed. It needed active management, divine attention paid to every domain of existence. the continuous oversight of specialized deities who ensured that each sphere of reality functioned properly and didn't fall into disorder. This is a much more complex and sophisticated picture than the simple narrative often presented in ancient astronaut literature, where gods create humans for a specific purpose and then largely withdraw from daily involvement in worldly affairs, except when their interests are threatened. The Sumerians saw their world as continuously sustained by divine activity, with gods actively involved in the ongoing operations of nature and civilization, present in every aspect of life, from the flooding of rivers to the birth of children to the success or failure of military campaigns. The divine realm and the human realm were not separate spheres with minimal interaction. They were intimately interconnected, with the boundary between them being permeable, and events in one realm directly affecting the other. The Anunnaki's true role. What role did the Anunnaki play in this elaborate divine organizational structure described in Enki and the World Order and similar texts? The texts describe them as a collective group, the offspring of An, as we've established, who function primarily as judges and determiners of fate, rather than as managers of natural processes or civilizational activities. They were associated particularly with the underworld, that dark realm beneath the earth where all mortals eventually travelled after death, and with the determination of human destinies, the fixing of fates that governed what would happen to each individual soul. This is completely different from the role assigned to them in ancient astronaut theory, where they are portrayed as the primary creators of humanity, as genetic engineers who travelled from another planet specifically to exploit Earth's resources. In the famous story of Inanna's descent to the underworld, one of the most powerful and moving compositions in all Sumerian literature, the Anunnaki appear in their characteristic role as the 7 judges who condemn the great goddess to death in the realm of the dead. When Inanna descends into the underworld to attend her sister's husband's funeral, when she passes through the 7 gates and loses an item of divine power at each one until she arrives naked and powerless before Ereshkigal's throne, the Anunnaki sit in judgment over her. They fasten their eyes of death upon her, that terrible gaze that strips away divine immortality and reduces even a goddess to a corpse. Inanna dies and is hung on a hook like a piece of meat, and for 3 days she remains dead until rescued by clever beings that Enki creates specifically to enter the underworld and retrieve her. This episode portrays the Anunnaki not as creators or managers of human civilization, not as technological beings with advanced capabilities, but as authorities over the final judgment, the ultimate fate that awaits all beings, mortal and divine. They're respected and feared for this power, certainly, but they're not the focus of creation narratives or the primary actors in organising the cosmos. They occupy a specific niche in the divine hierarchy, performing an essential function, but not the founding or creative function that ancient astronaut theory attributes to them. Part 4. The Great Flood. The antediluvian cities and their long-lived kings represented, in mythological understanding, the first implementation of divine social order. When kingship descended from heaven and was established in Eridu, it brought not just political authority, but an entire package of civilizational technologies, practices, and institutions. The 5 antediluvian cities, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurapak, were the prototypes, the original examples of how the gods intended civilization to function, models that post-flood cities would attempt to recreate after the catastrophe had wiped away the original pattern. But this age of close divine-human contact was fundamentally unstable. It ultimately ended by divine decree through the catastrophe of the flood that swept away the antediluvian world. The Eridu Genesis, the oldest surviving narrative of the Great about the destruction of the old order and the establishment of the new. The text, preserved on a badly damaged cuneiform tablet, from which about 2/3 of the content has been lost to the ravages of time, begins with a description of creation that parallels other Sumerian cosmogonic texts. The gods created humanity, the black-headed people, as the Sumerians called themselves, a term emphasizing their dark hair as distinguished from the lighter-haired peoples of the mountains and northern regions, and gave them the fundamental gifts of civilization. Cities were founded across the fertile plains of Mesopotamia and placed under the patronage of specific deities who would serve as their protectors and benefactors. Eridu, that first and holiest city, belonged to Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet water who dwelt in the cosmic ocean beneath the earth. Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak each received their patron gods, completing this sacred geography of the world before the flood. Each city represented a particular aspect of divine presence in the mortal realm, a specific function within the cosmic order, a unique contribution to the project of civilization. But then, as the text describes in the portions that survive, and as we can infer from later versions of the flood story, something went profoundly wrong with this initially harmonious arrangement between gods and humans. The noise of humanity multiplied across the fertile plains, filling the cities with their activity and commerce and daily life. They prospered under divine protection, engaging in all the activities of civilization, building and farming and trading and reproducing. The cities grew larger, more populous, more vibrant with human energy. And their noise, the constant tumult of human activity, the clamour of crowded cities full of people going about their business, the din of markets and workshops and homes and streets, disturbed the gods who dwelt in temples and celestial palaces. This detail, which appears in multiple versions of the Mesopotamian flood story, including the later Akkadian Atrahasis epic, is absolutely crucial for understanding Sumerian theology and the divine-human relationship as these texts conceived it. The gods didn't decide to destroy humanity because humans were evil or sinful in a moral sense, because they had violated divine commandments or fallen from an initial state of grace. The motivation was much more mundane and, in some ways, more disturbing from our modern perspective. Humans were too numerous, too successful, too vibrant with life and activity. They filled the world with noise that kept the gods awake, that disturbed divine peace and tranquility, that made the cosmos too busy, too loud, too chaotic for divine comfort. Enlil, the powerful god of air and storms who held supreme authority over the earth realm after separating heaven from earth at the beginning of creation, found himself unable to sleep because of the constant tumult of human civilization. The cities were too crowded, he complained to the divine assembly. Humans were too loud, too busy, too present everywhere. Their noise rose up to the heavens, where gods dwelt, making rest impossible, turning what should have been peaceful divine existence into an ordeal of constant disturbance. And so, after consulting with other senior gods and receiving their grudging agreement, Enlil made the catastrophic decision to destroy humanity with a great flood that would sweep over the land, wiping away the cities and their noisy inhabitants, returning the world to the quiet primordial state it had enjoyed before humans multiplied so abundantly. This is a strikingly anthropomorphic motivation for cosmic catastrophe, showing gods who act from irritation and desire for comfort rather than from abstract justice or cosmic necessity. It reflects something profound about the Sumerian worldview and their understanding of the relationship between civilization and nature. Human civilization, for all its benefits and achievements, for all the ways it elevated humanity above animal existence, inevitably created disturbance and disruption. It changed the natural order, imposing human will upon the environment through agriculture and construction and all the other activities of civilized life, and by doing so, it inevitably created conflict with forces beyond human control, with the divine powers who preferred quiet and stability to the dynamic chaos of human activity. Enki's subversion. But one god disagreed with this decision to annihilate humanity completely. Enki, the lord of wisdom and sweet water, the clever god who often appeared in Sumerian texts as more sympathetic to humanity than his peers, believed that total destruction was excessive punishment for the crime of being too numerous and noisy. He recognized that humans served a useful purpose, performing the agricultural labor that the gods themselves had found burdensome, maintaining the temples and making the offerings that sustained divine existence in the mortal realm. Eliminating them entirely would force the gods back to the very labor problem that had motivated human creation in the first place. The texts portray Enki as a trickster figure in this episode, clever and subversive, willing to circumvent the decrees of more powerful but less imaginative gods when he believed they were making a terrible mistake. He couldn't openly defy Enlil's decree, couldn't stand before the divine assembly and argue for humanity's preservation, because the decision had already been made and divine decrees were understood as irrevocable once pronounced. The word of the gods, once spoken in formal assembly, had the force of cosmic law that even individual deities couldn't simply reverse. But he could work around it, finding loopholes, using his characteristic cunning to achieve his goals without directly violating the letter of divine law. Enki appeared to Ziusudra, king of Shurupak, the last of the antediluvian rulers, the son of Ubatutu, who had ruled before him. Different versions of the story describe this crucial revelation in slightly different ways, reflecting the multiple traditions that circulated in ancient Mesopotamia about the flood and its hero. In some versions, Enki comes to Ziusudra in a dream, speaking through the medium of sleep to deliver his warning without openly defying Enlil. Dreams were understood as legitimate channels of divine communication, and warnings received in dreams didn't technically violate the prohibition against revealing the coming disaster. In other versions, he positions himself on one side of a reed wall that forms part of Ziusudra's house, speaking loudly as if talking to the wall itself, perhaps discussing the matter with himself or with another deity, while Ziusudra, on the other side of the wall, overhears what is being said without Enki technically having made direct communication with him. This elaborate subterfuge, this careful manoeuvring around the technicalities of divine law, shows the Sumerian gods as bound by their own rules and precedents, not operating with complete freedom to do whatever they wished at any moment. The divine realm had its own legal structures, its own protocols and procedures that even the gods had to respect. This wasn't arbitrary tyranny, but cosmic order maintained through established principles. The warning and the boat. The message Enki delivered, whether through dreams or walls, or some other indirect means depending on which version we follow, was absolutely clear and urgent. A flood was coming. The assembly of the gods had decreed the destruction of humanity. The decision was final, irrevocable, beyond appeal. The waters would rise and cover the land, drowning everything and everyone. But you can save yourself, Enki continued. Save your family. Save representatives of all living species, both wild and domestic. Save the seed of civilization so that the world can be repopulated after the waters recede and life can begin again. Build a great boat, he instructed, giving specifications about its construction that the damaged state of the tablet has unfortunately rendered largely illegible. Make it watertight, capable of withstanding the violence of the coming storm. Load it with animals of every kind, ensuring that the diversity of life would survive the catastrophe. Prepare provisions food and water sufficient to sustain both humans and animals through however many days or weeks the deluge would last. The text provides some tantalizing details about this vessel's construction in the portions that survive, though frustratingly, key sections are lost due to damage to the clay tablet that preserved this story. We know that Ziusudra built the boat according to Enki's divine instructions, working presumably with help from family members and perhaps trusted servants who could keep the project secret from other gods and from the general population who might have panicked if they knew what was coming. The boat had to be large enough to hold not just Ziusudra and his immediate family, but also breeding pairs of all animal species. A massive undertaking requiring careful planning and considerable resources. He loaded the boat with representatives of all animal species, both wild and domestic, ensuring that the diversity of life would survive the coming catastrophe. He gathered provisions, stores of grain and dried meat and beer and water, everything necessary to sustain life during the deluge and in the immediate aftermath when the land would be barren and unproductive. Then, with preparations complete and the boat sealed against the coming waters, with everything secured and everyone aboard, the flood arrived, with a violence that the text describes in vivid and terrifying terms that have lost none of their power despite being recorded on clay 4,000 years ago. The deluge, all the evil winds gathered together, every stormy blast from every direction, north and south, east and west, converging into a single catastrophic force of unprecedented power. The flood swept over the cities of the half-bushel baskets, that poetic phrase referring to the standard units of measure used in Sumerian trade and commerce, indicating that these were the productive centres of civilization being destroyed, the places where grain was measured and distributed, where economic life was organised. For 7 days and 7 nights, the deluge continued without pause, without any break in the storm's fury. The massive boat tossed about on the great waters like a toy, battered by waves and wind, while outside the world drowned beneath the rising waters. The cities that humanity had built with such tremendous effort over generations, those centres of civilization where temples rose to the heavens and markets bustled with trade and scribes, recorded transactions in the newly invented writing, were submerged and destroyed, their walls crumbling, their buildings collapsing, their inhabitants drowning. The ordered world that the gods had established after separating heaven from earth, the cosmos of cultivated fields and irrigation canals and urban streets, was temporarily undone, returned to the primordial state of chaos and undifferentiated waters that had existed before creation itself. Everything humanity had achieved, every monument they had raised, every innovation they had developed, every bit of knowledge they had accumulated, seemed to be wiped away, as if it had never existed. The antediluvian world was ending, drowning beneath the flood, disappearing into the chaos of the primordial waters. When the storm finally ended, after that terrible week of wind and rain and rising water, when the fury of the flood exhausted itself, and the waters began very slowly to recede, draining away back into the earth and evaporating into the sky, Ziusudra opened a window in the great boat to see what remained of the world he had known. After the storm, the sun god Utu, who had been hidden behind storm clouds for 7 days and nights, unable to bring his light to the darkened world, now sent his blessed rays into the vessel's dark interior, illuminating the space where Ziusudra and his family and all the animals had huddled together in darkness, waiting for the catastrophe to end. Ziusudra emerged onto the deck, or possibly onto newly revealed land. We're not entirely certain, because the text is damaged at this crucial point in the narrative, and immediately, before doing anything else, before checking on his family or surveying the damage or beginning the work of rebuilding, his first action was to perform sacrifices to the gods. He butchered oxen as offerings to the divine powers who had both decreed the flood and provided the means of survival. He lavished sheep, presenting multiple animals as thanksgiving for deliverance from the waters that had destroyed everything else. He prepared barley cakes and crescent-shaped bread as offerings, traditional foods associated with religious ritual and temple service. He burned juniper, that pure plant of the mountains, whose fragrant smoke was believed to be particularly pleasing to gods, sending its sweet aroma up to the heavens as a sign that humanity still lived and still worshipped. This detail about immediate sacrifice, about worship and thanksgiving being Ziusudra's first priority after surviving the apocalypse, is profoundly important for understanding the Sumerian religious worldview. Even though the gods, specifically Enlil, had decreed humanity's complete destruction, even though divine action had caused the catastrophe that killed everyone except this single family and their animal cargo, even though the gods had proven themselves capable of destroying civilization on a whim because humans made too much noise, the proper response of the survivor was worship and propitiation and thanksgiving. The Sumerian worldview didn't include a concept of gods as purely benevolent protectors who always acted in humanity's best interest, who deserved worship because they were good in a moral sense. The divine powers were recognized as capricious, sometimes helpful and sometimes hostile, sometimes preserving life, and sometimes destroying it according to their own inscrutable purposes and desires. But they were always deserving of respect and worship, always demanding propitiation regardless of their actions, because they were gods and humans were utterly dependent on their favour for survival. The relationship between humans and gods was not based on mutual affection or moral principles, but on pragmatic recognition of power, differentials, and the need to maintain divine goodwill through proper ritual and sacrifice. Divine reconciliation. The text of the Eridu Genesis breaks off after describing these sacrifices, with large portions of the tablet lost to damage and the ravages of time. But we can reconstruct what must have followed from later versions of the flood story, preserved in the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, and in the flood narrative incorporated into the Epic of Gilgamesh, which draw on the same core tradition. Enlil discovered that humans had survived his attempted genocide, that his decree of total destruction had been subverted by Enki's clever intervention. He was absolutely furious. His rage at being thwarted, probably intensified by the realization that another god had undermined his authority, had violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Divine Assembly's decision. He demanded to know which deity had revealed the secret of the coming flood, and enabled a human to escape the destruction that was meant to be complete and final. Enki admitted his role, stepping forward before the Divine Assembly to accept responsibility for his actions and to justify them. He argued that humanity deserved a chance to survive, that they had not committed some heinous crime deserving extinction, that they served useful purposes for the gods that would be lost if they were completely eliminated. He pointed out that complete annihilation would have been excessive and ultimately counterproductive punishment for the relatively minor offence of being too numerous and making too much noise. The Assembly of Gods debated this crisis, argued about appropriate responses, considered the implications of Enki's defiance of Enlil's decree, and the survival of humanity against the will of the supreme god of Earth. Eventually, through processes of divine negotiation and compromise that the texts don't fully specify, they reached an accommodation that satisfied both Enlil's desire to reduce human population and noise, and Enki's concern that humanity should be allowed to continue existing. Humanity could continue to exist, the Assembly decided, but measures would be implemented to control their population and reduce the noise that had so disturbed Enlil in the first place. The post-flood limitations. Some texts suggest that this is when various biological and social limitations were imposed on human existence as divine punishment or population control measures designed to prevent humanity from ever again growing so numerous that they would disturb divine peace. Mortality itself, which may not have been quite so absolute in the antediluvian age when kings could rule for thousands of years, became a fixed and unavoidable condition of human existence. Death was no longer something that could be postponed indefinitely for exceptional individuals, but became the inevitable fate of every mortal. Human lifespans were deliberately reduced to reasonable lengths, perhaps only a century or so, rather than the multiple millennia that antediluvian rulers had enjoyed. This limitation ensured that no single individual could accumulate too much power or knowledge that each generation would have to relearn what the previous generation had known. Women's fertility was regulated through divine decree, the texts suggest, through the institution of women who remained barren throughout their lives, unable to bear children despite their desire for offspring, and through the tragically common deaths of infants before they reached maturity. These grim measures, which would cause such suffering in actual human experience, were attributed to divine policy, to deliberate decisions made by gods to keep human population from growing so large that noise would again become a problem requiring such drastic intervention. Some versions of the story also mention the institution of wild animals who would attack and kill humans, reducing population through predation, and of diseases that would carry people off before their time. Additional mechanisms for population control imposed by divine will to maintain the balance between humans and gods. Ziusudra's reward. Ziusudra himself received special treatment in recognition of his obedience and piety, his faithfulness in following Enki's instructions even when they required tremendous effort, and must have seemed insane to observers who didn't know about the coming flood. The gods granted him eternal life, transforming him from a mortal into something approaching divine status, making him one of the very few humans in Mesopotamian tradition who escaped death entirely and achieved immortality. They allowed him to dwell in Dilmun, a mythical paradise located somewhere at the eastern edge of the known world, where the sun rises each morning, bringing light to dispel darkness, where life continues in perfect harmony without the suffering and death that characterize ordinary existence. Dilmun appears in multiple Sumerian texts as a pure and pristine land, a place of peace and abundance, completely free from disease and death, and all the afflictions plaguing ordinary mortal existence. It's described as a place where no lion kills, where no wolf snatches lambs, where old age and illness are unknown concepts, where death itself has no dominion. By placing Ziusudra there after the flood, the gods removed him from ordinary human society, preserving him as a living link to the antediluvian past, as someone who could testify to what the world was like before the catastrophe, but who would not interfere with the new post-flood order that the gods were establishing. Archaeological evidence of the flood. Archaeological evidence provides fascinating context for these textual traditions, grounding the mythology in actual historical events, even while recognizing that the stories themselves have been shaped by centuries of theological reflection and narrative development. Excavations at several Mesopotamian sites, including Shuruppak itself, the city named in the flood story as Ziusudra's home, have revealed clear evidence of significant flooding events dating to around 2900 BCE, right at the transition between the Chemdet-Nazr period and the early dynastic period when Sumerian civilization was consolidating and the city-states were emerging as the dominant form of political organization. At Shuruppak, archaeologists discovered a substantial layer of riverine sediments deposited by floodwaters, interrupting the continuity of settlement and suggesting that the city was temporarily abandoned after a major inundation before being reoccupied and rebuilt by survivors or new settlers. Similar flood layers from approximately the same time period have been found at other early Sumerian cities, including Kish in the north and in the south, indicating that this was a regional phenomenon affecting multiple sites rather than a localized event at a single city. The flood deposits don't represent a worldwide deluge in the geological sense, of course. They're evidence of catastrophic but geographically limited flooding. Events in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, probably caused by exceptional combinations of heavy rain in the mountains, where both rivers originated, and high river levels from spring snowmelt arriving at the plains simultaneously. But for the people who experienced these floods directly, who watched the rivers overflow their banks and spread across the flat plains for miles in every direction, who saw their fields and homes and temples submerged underwater, who had to flee to higher ground or drown, these events would have seemed genuinely world-ending. The Mesopotamian plain was effectively the entire world as far as these early Sumerians were concerned. They had no knowledge of distant continents or far-off lands beyond the mountains and deserts surrounding their homeland. When the familiar landscape disappeared underwater, and everything recognizable was destroyed, this was an apocalypse in the truest sense, an ending of the world as they knew it. The Sumerian flood myth preserves the traumatic memory of these catastrophic events, transforming them from natural disasters into theological narratives that explained why such terrible things happened, and what they meant for humanity's relationship with the divine realm. Part 5. The Complex Cosmology. Let's examine more closely the cosmological framework that the Sumerian texts establish in multiple compositions, because understanding this framework is absolutely essential for properly contextualizing the Anunnaki and all other divine beings within Sumerian theology. The Sumerians conceived of the universe as having three main levels or realms: a vertical structure that organized all existence into distinct but interconnected domains. At the top of this cosmic architecture was An, heaven, the domain of the sky god whose name was identical with the realm he ruled. The celestial sphere far above the earth, where sun and moon and stars moved in their eternal courses. This uppermost realm was the source of rain making agriculture possible, of storms that could destroy or nourish depending on their intensity, of all celestial phenomena governing the rhythms of time and seasons. It was the dwelling place of the most powerful gods, particularly An himself, who rarely intervened directly in earthly affairs, but whose authority was acknowledged by all other deities. Heaven was remote, unreachable by ordinary humans, separated from the mortal world by an unbridgeable gap, yet intimately connected to earth through weather and through divine will that shaped events below. In the middle of this three-tiered structure was Kyu, the earth, the solid ground where humans and animals and plants existed, the manifest world of forms and activities. This was the realm of human civilization, where cities were built and fields cultivated, where daily life unfolded under the watchful eyes of the gods. The earth wasn't simply a passive stage where events happened. It was itself a divine being in some texts. The goddess Ki, who had been separated from her consort An by their son Enlil, who continued to sustain life through her fertility and stability. But the earth wasn't conceived as a simple flat surface floating in empty space, which is sometimes how we imagine ancient cosmologies in our modern simplification. The Sumerians understood the earth as resting upon or surrounded by water, specifically by the Abzu, that cosmic ocean of fresh water we discussed earlier as Enki's domain. This subterranean realm of primordial waters represented the third major division of the cosmos in Sumerian thought, distinct from both heaven above and earth's surface. The Abzu wasn't the underworld in the sense of the land of the dead, though the two concepts were related and sometimes overlapped in mythological geography. The Abzu was specifically the realm of fresh water, the cosmic deep from which all springs and wells and rivers ultimately flowed. It was the source of fertility and life, providing the irrigation water that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible, and thus sustained civilization itself. Enki dwelt in the Abzu, in a magnificent palace adorned with precious stones and metals. Lapis lazuli and carnelian, silver and gold, ruling over this primordial ocean, controlling the flow of waters that sustained existence on Earth's surface. Enki's temple at Eridu, the Abzu, was understood as built directly over the point where these cosmic waters broke through to the surface world, where humans could access the sacred depths through ritual and offering, where the boundary between the ordered world and the primordial chaos was thinnest. When priests performed ceremonies in this temple, they believed they were standing at the boundary between Earth and the primordial ocean, at a thin place where the veil between realms was permeable, and divine power could flow more easily into the human world. The complexity of the heavens. This three-tiered cosmology was actually more complex and elaborate than it might initially appear from this simplified description. The texts describe the sky not as a single solid dome, but as multiple layers stacked one above another. Usually 3 heavens, but sometimes 7 in more elaborate cosmological schemes that developed over time, each made of a different precious stone that gave it distinctive characteristics and associations. The lowest dome of heaven, the one visible to humans looking upward from Earth, was made of jasper, that semi-precious stone with its characteristic patterns and colours. This lowest heaven housed the stars, those points of light that appeared at night and that the Sumerians recognized as following regular patterns across the sky, patterns that could be used to mark the passage of seasons and to navigate across trackless deserts. The middle dome of heaven was made of a stone the Sumerians called sagalmut, though we're not entirely certain what mineral this refers to in modern geological terms. Scholars have suggested it might be a type of lapis lazuli or another blue stone, but the identification remains uncertain. This middle heaven was the dwelling place of the Igigi, a class of gods associated with celestial phenomena and with the work of maintaining cosmic order. The Igigi were somewhat junior to the great gods and the Anunnaki, but still divine beings worthy of respect, performing essential functions in the divine bureaucracy that governed existence. The highest dome of heaven, furthest from Earth and closest to pure divinity, was made of luludanitu stone, possibly referring to some form of red jasper or carnelian. This was where An himself dwelt in splendid isolation, presiding over all existence from his remote and exalted position, rarely intervening directly in affairs below, but maintaining ultimate authority over the cosmic order. The underworld realm. Below Earth's surface, in addition to the Abzu with its life-giving fresh water, there was also the underworld proper, called Kur in Sumerian, or sometimes Ikala in later Akkadian traditions. The land of the dead, where all mortal souls eventually travelled regardless of how they had lived their earthly lives. This realm was ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, whose name means Lady of the Great Place Below, and by her consort Nergal, a god associated with war and pestilence and violent death, with all the forces that bring mortals to their end. The underworld was consistently described in Sumerian texts as a dark and dreary place, a realm of dust and shadow where the dead existed in a grim parody of life, deprived of all the pleasures they had enjoyed while alive. The dead in the Sumerian underworld ate only dust and clay, the most unappetizing substances imaginable, completely unlike the bread and beer and meat that had sustained them in life. They dwelt in darkness without the comforting light of sun or moon or stars that had illuminated their days and nights above. They wore feathers like birds, a curious detail that appears in multiple texts, perhaps suggesting their transformation into something inhuman and alien, no longer fully recognizable as the people they had been. They were separated forever from the warmth and light and joy of the upper world, condemned to this cheerless existence simply by virtue of being mortal and therefore subject to death, not because of their moral failings or ethical choices, but simply because they were human, and death was the inevitable fate of all humans. This underworld was not a place of punishment in the later Christian sense of hell, where sinners suffered torments proportional to their crimes, while the righteous enjoyed paradisial rewards. It was simply where all dead souls went, the inevitable destination of every mortal, regardless of their moral character or their achievements in life. The Sumerians had no concept of heaven as reward for righteousness or hell as punishment for wickedness. No idea of afterlife justice where the good were rewarded and the evil punished. Death was the great equalizer, sending king and slave, saint and sinner, hero and coward to the same grim subterranean realm. The quality of a person's afterlife depended not on their moral choices or their accomplishments, but on whether their family continued to perform proper funerary rituals, pouring libations of water and beer at their grave, making offerings of bread and meat, speaking their name in prayers so they would not be forgotten. Those who were properly mourned and remembered through regular offerings experienced a slightly less miserable existence in the underworld. Those who were forgotten, whose families failed to maintain their funerary cult, suffered even greater wretchedness, wandering as ghosts unable to find rest. The Anunnaki as underworld judges, the Anunnaki occupied a very specific place within this cosmological framework, particularly associated with the underworld realm, with Kur, with the domain of the dead where all mortals eventually journeyed. They served as judges of the deceased, the seven who decree, sitting in solemn assembly to determine the fate of each soul that entered the land of no return, the realm from which no traveller ever came back. This role is completely different from, and incompatible with, the ancient astronaut interpretation of the Anunnaki as spacefaring technologists, as aliens who came from another planet to exploit Earth's resources for their own purposes. The texts consistently portray them as chthonic deities, gods of earth and underworld, associated with fate and judgment and the inexorable boundary between life and death, not with the heavens or with extraterrestrial origins or with advanced technology. In the famous narrative of Inanna's descent to the underworld, when the great goddess, queen of heaven and earth, goddess of love and war, descends to the realm of the dead to attend her sister's husband's funeral, she must pass through 7 gates, surrendering an item of divine power at each one. At the first gate, she surrenders her crown, the symbol of her sovereignty. At the second, her necklace of lapis lazuli. At the third, her breastplate. Continuing through all 7 gates until she arrives naked and powerless before her sister Ereshkigal's throne, stripped of all the divine attributes that made her powerful in the upper world. The Anunnaki, described as the 7 judges, sit in assembly to hear the case against Inanna. Despite her divine status, despite her power in the upper world, despite her position as one of the greatest gods of the Sumerian pantheon, they have authority over her in this realm. They fasten their eyes of death upon her, that terrible gaze that strips away divine immortality and reduces even a goddess to a corpse. The power of these eyes is absolute in their domain, capable of killing even beings who are normally immortal. Inanna dies under their gaze and is hung on a hook like a piece of meat, and for 3 days she remains dead, her body rotting in the underworld until rescued by magical beings that Enki creates specifically to enter the realm of the dead and retrieve her. This episode demonstrates that the Anunnaki's power in their own domain was absolute, able to kill even a great goddess, able to exercise judgment that the most powerful divine beings had to submit to when they entered the underworld. Even Inanna, with all her divine authority and power, could not resist their judgment when she voluntarily entered their realm. The underworld had its own rules, its own hierarchy, its own authorities who wielded supreme power within their domain, even if they were less prominent in the affairs of the upper world. This portrayal is completely incompatible with the ancient astronaut interpretation. These are not technological beings with advanced equipment, not aliens with scientific knowledge beyond our comprehension. They are chthonic judges, underworld authorities, beings whose power comes from their position at the ultimate boundary that all life must cross. The transition from living to dead, from existence to non-existence. They operate through supernatural judgment, through the eyes of death that kill by looking, through the pronouncement of fates that cannot be appealed or reversed, not through any mechanism that could be described as technological or scientific in our modern understanding of those terms. Part 6. The ME and cultural transmission. The concept of the me that appears in multiple Sumerian texts deserves extensive examination because it reveals how these ancient people understood the transmission of civilization, the establishment of social order, and the divine origins of cultural institutions. The me were divine decrees or principles, fundamental patterns that governed various aspects of civilized existence. Scholars have translated this Sumerian word in different ways, sometimes as divine powers, sometimes as cultural norms, sometimes as cosmic principles, reflecting the difficulty of capturing its full meaning in modern languages that don't have an exact equivalent. Recent research has emphasized understanding the me not as abstract concepts, but as actual practices, specific rituals and procedures that had to be performed correctly to maintain cosmic and social order. They were knowledge embodied in action, wisdom preserved through proper performance, rather than through theoretical understanding alone. The me included kingship itself, the right and ability to rule over others, the authority to command and be obeyed, the sacred office that mediated between divine and human realms. Without the me of kingship, there could be no legitimate rulers, no stable political order. They included priesthood, the specialized knowledge required to serve the gods properly in temples, to perform rituals correctly, to interpret omens and divine will. The priesthood was not just a profession, but a sacred calling dependent on possession of the appropriate me. They included truth and law, the principles of justice that allowed societies to function without descending into chaos, that made it possible for disputes to be resolved fairly, for agreements to be enforced, for social harmony to be maintained. They included sexual intercourse and prostitution, both sacred and profane aspects of human reproduction and pleasure, recognizing that these fundamental human activities required divine sanction and proper regulation to function within civilized society. The me encompassed art and music, the creative expressions that made life more than mere survival, that allowed humans to transcend their material needs and create beauty, that connected the mundane world to the divine realm through aesthetic experience. They included crafts and technologies, everything from metalwork to weaving to building construction, all the practical skills that made civilization possible and that had to be learned and transmitted across generations. They included warfare and weapons, the martial arts that allowed cities to defend themselves against enemies or to conquer neighbours, recognizing that organized violence was itself a civilizational achievement requiring divine sanction. They even included descent into the underworld, suggesting that even the journey to death, even the transition from living to dead, had to be undertaken according to proper procedure, following established patterns that the me encoded. The complete list of me mentioned in various Sumerian texts numbers more than 100 separate items, covering virtually every aspect of civilized human existence, from the most exalted religious rituals to the most mundane practical activities. Inanna steals the ME. In the myth called Inanna and Enki, we see these divine principles in action and learn how they were transmitted from one centre of power to another. The goddess Inanna travels to Eridu, that oldest and holiest of cities, the sacred centre where Enki dwelt in his temple over the cosmic waters, to visit the god of wisdom. Enki, being a hospitable god, and perhaps also being somewhat susceptible to the charms of beautiful goddesses, entertains Inanna lavishly. He plies her with beer and wine, offering her drink after drink in the traditional rituals of Mesopotamian hospitality. As the god of wisdom drinks more and more, his judgment becomes increasingly impaired, his normally sharp mind dulled by alcohol. In his intoxicated state, Enki makes the catastrophic decision to give Inanna the me, to transfer these fundamental principles of civilization from his possession to hers, from Eridu to Uruk, from the oldest city to the newer but more dynamic urban centre, where Inanna was patron goddess. One by one, he hands over the divine powers. Kingship and priesthood, truth and falsehood, the art of lovemaking and the descent to the underworld, craftsmanship and warfare, music and writing. More than 100 me pass from Enki's control, Inanna's possession, while the god of wisdom is too drunk to recognise what he's doing. The next morning, when sobriety returns and the effects of the alcohol wear off, Enki realises what he's done. He's given away the very foundations of civilization, transferred cosmic principles that were meant to remain in Eridu to this ambitious goddess who plans to take them to her own city. He desperately tries to prevent Inanna from leaving Eridu with the me, sending his minister, Isimud, and various magical servants to intercept her and recover these precious divine powers before they leave the sacred precincts of the oldest city. But Inanna and her servant Ninshubur cleverly evade these pursuers through a series of confrontations described in delightful detail in the text. Each time Enki's servants catch up with her, Ninshubur defends the goddess and helps her escape, outmanoeuvring the agents of the god of wisdom through quick thinking and loyal service. They make their way back to Uruk successfully, transporting the me from Eridu to Inanna's own city, establishing Uruk as the new centre of civilization and power in ancient Sumer. The meaning of the myth. This mythological episode served to explain why Uruk, rather than Eridu, became the dominant city in early Sumerian history, why political and cultural power shifted from the oldest sacred centre to a newer but more dynamic urban centre. But it also reveals deeper truths about how the Sumerians understood civilization and its origins. Cultural knowledge, technological expertise, social institutions, all the things that made urban life possible, were not human inventions that emerged through trial and error over long periods of time. They were divine gifts, sacred knowledge that had to be properly transmitted and carefully preserved. The me had to be obtained from the gods who originally possessed them, acquired through some combination of divine favour, clever negotiation, and sometimes outright theft, as in Inanna's case. This theological understanding of culture's origins wasn't primitive superstition or failure to recognise human agency and innovation. It was a sophisticated way of acknowledging that civilization depended on accumulated knowledge passed down through generations, on techniques and practices that had to be learned rather than being innately known, on cultural inheritance that each generation received from ancestors and had responsibility to transmit to descendants. By attributing the me to divine origins, the Sumerians were emphasizing their sacred importance, protecting them from casual modification or thoughtless abandonment, ensuring that the fundamental patterns of civilized life would be preserved and transmitted faithfully across time. The transfer of the me from Eridu to Uruk represented not just a shift in political power, but a recognition that civilization could move, that sacred knowledge could be transmitted to new centers, that the patterns established at creation could be successfully replicated in new locations. Part 7. Temple Economics and Administration. The temple complexes that dominated Sumerian cities served as repositories and centers for the performance of the me, institutions where this sacred knowledge was preserved and enacted through daily rituals and seasonal ceremonies. These weren't simply religious buildings in our modern sense, separate from economic and political activity, places where people went once a week to worship while conducting the rest of their lives in purely secular spaces. Sumerian temples were economic powerhouses, centers of production and redistribution, institutions that managed vast agricultural estates, employed hundreds or thousands of workers in various capacities, collected taxes and tribute, and distributed resources according to complex hierarchical systems. The temple dedicated to Inanna in Uruk, called the Inanna, or House of Heaven, controlled enormous agricultural lands that stretched for miles around the city, worked by dependent labourers who received rations of food and clothing in exchange for their work. The temple maintained workshops where specialised craftspeople produced textiles from wool brought in from temple flocks, pottery from clay dug from temple lands, metal goods from copper and bronze acquired through trade, stone carvings and cylinder seals, and countless other products that supplied both the temple's own needs and generated surplus for trade. It operated as a major trading institution, exchanging Mesopotamian grain and manufactured goods for raw materials that weren't available locally, including timber from the mountains of Lebanon and Anatolia, stones for construction and sculpture from quarries in distant regions, metals like copper from Oman and tin from Afghanistan, exotic items from lands as far away as the Indus Valley. Archaeological excavations of temple complexes have revealed extensive archives, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets recording economic transactions in meticulous detail, documenting every aspect of the temple economy with remarkable precision. These texts list deliveries of grain from specific fields, measured in standard units, and credited to named farmers or administrators responsible for production. They record distributions of bread and beer rations to named workers, documenting daily or monthly allotments that allowed temple overseers to ensure everyone received their proper share according to their rank and role. They inventory livestock, counting sheep and goats and cattle, tracking their multiplication through births and their diminishment through deaths or sacrifices or sales, maintaining running tallies of the temple's animal wealth. They list tools and equipment, making sure that valuable metal implements like ploughs and sickles weren't lost or stolen, that loaned items were returned, that the temple's material assets were properly accounted for. They document the production of textiles, recording how much wool was delivered to workshops, how many hours of labour were expended in spinning and weaving, how many finished garments were produced, and what became of them, whether they were used to clothe temple personnel, offered to the gods, traded for other goods, or distributed as payment to workers. The sheer volume and complexity of this record-keeping demonstrates that Sumerian temples were managing sophisticated economic operations on a scale that required writing for effective administration, that couldn't possibly have been maintained through memory alone or through simple tally marks. The development of writing indeed, writing itself developed precisely to meet these administrative needs, beginning as a tool for tracking economic flows before later expanding to record literature, history, laws, and religious texts. Writing emerged in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE according to archaeological evidence, making it one of the world's earliest writing systems, along with the roughly contemporary Egyptian hieroglyphs that developed independently in the Nile Valley. The earliest Sumerian tablets that archaeologists have discovered aren't religious hymns or mythological narratives or historical chronicles celebrating the deeds of kings. They're accounting records, administrative documents, tracking the mundane but essential flows of goods and labour that made urban civilization possible. These primitive texts from the late 4th millennium BCE list deliveries of barley from specific fields to temple granaries, sometimes with the names of the farmers or administrators responsible, sometimes just with field designations and quantities. They record distributions of bread and beer rations to named workers, documentation that allowed temple overseers to ensure everyone received their proper allotment, and that could serve as evidence if disputes arose about whether someone had been paid. They inventory livestock, counting sheep and goats and cattle with simple numerical notations, tracking their movements between different pastures or pens, maintaining running tallies of the temple's animal wealth from season to season and year to year. They list tools and equipment with ideographic signs that evolved into the cuneiform script, making sure that valuable metal implements weren't lost or stolen, that borrowed items were returned, that accountability was maintained. They document the production of textiles, recording quantities of wool and numbers of finished garments with remarkable precision given the early stage of writing's development. Only later, once writing had been established as a practical administrative technology that clearly provided advantages in managing complex organizations, did Sumerian scribes begin using this tool for other purposes beyond accounting. Religious hymns praising the gods and describing their attributes were among the first literary texts, appearing in the early 3rd millennium BCE. These compositions celebrated the deities, worshipped in major temples, described their powers and characteristics, recounted their mythological deeds. Then came mythological narratives like the ones we've been examining throughout this video. Stories about creation and the flood and divine adventures, preserving the theological traditions and cosmological understanding of Sumerian culture in permanent written form. Legal codes appeared, systematizing the principles of justice and documenting penalties for various crimes, creating written standards that could be consulted and applied consistently rather than relying solely on oral tradition and judicial discretion. Historical texts emerged, recording the deeds of kings and the victories of armies, celebrating military campaigns and building projects, establishing official narratives of dynastic succession and territorial expansion. Wisdom literature developed, collections of proverbs and teachings designed to educate scribes and transmit cultural values across generations, preserving the accumulated knowledge of Sumerian civilization in forms that could be studied and memorized. This trajectory from economic administration to literary and historical expression tells us something profound about Sumerian civilization and how it understood the relationship between the practical and the sacred. These were not separate domains in Sumerian thought, not distinct spheres that could be clearly separated from each other. The temple was simultaneously a religious center dedicated to worshipping the gods and an economic hub managing the productive resources of the community. The sacred and the practical were intimately intertwined, both essential aspects of the same civilizational project, both necessary for maintaining cosmic order and ensuring human flourishing. Divine kingship and political legitimation. The texts describe kingship as a mediating institution within this theological economic system, the linchpin connecting divine will to human action, cosmic order to social structure. The king was not himself divine in early Sumerian thought, though later rulers would sometimes claim divine status during their lifetimes, or be deified after death, and worshipped in temples alongside the traditional gods. Instead, the king was understood as the earthly representative of the divine realm, chosen by the gods to exercise authority over human affairs on their behalf, selected through divine election to serve as steward of cosmic order in the mortal sphere. His legitimacy derived from divine selection, from the fact that kingship had descended from heaven as a sacred gift, and had been entrusted to him as the custodian of this divine institution, the guardian of the patterns established at creation. This explains the formula that appears repeatedly throughout the Sumerian king list, with its almost liturgical repetition, its ritual invocation of divine origins for political authority. After the flood swept over the earth, after the catastrophe had ended the antediluvian age, kingship descended from heaven once again, and the kingship was established in Kish, the first city to receive this divine gift in the post-flood world. This wasn't describing a literal physical descent of some object or person from the sky, not suggesting that aliens landed and established political institutions. It was expressing the theological principle that political authority had divine origins, that the right to rule came from the gods rather than from human consent, or military conquest, or economic power, or any purely secular source. Of course, in actual historical practice, rulers gained and held power through very human means, including military force that defeated rivals and intimidated subjects, political alliances that brought together coalitions of supporters, economic resources that could be used to reward loyalty and punish defiance, and personal charisma or administrative competence that inspired confidence and obedience. But the ideology of divine kingship provided religious legitimation for their authority, transforming political power from mere domination backed by force into sacred office backed by cosmic order, making rebellion not just a political act, but a theological crime, an offence against the divine structure of reality itself. This legitimation was mutually beneficial, a symbiotic relationship between religious and political institutions. It helped kings justify their authority and secure obedience from subjects who might otherwise resist or rebel, while giving priests and temples powerful royal patrons who protected their interests, funded their operations, and enforced their prerogatives against rivals. The king built and maintained temples, ensuring that the gods had proper dwelling places in the mortal realm. He provided resources for daily offerings and seasonal festivals, guaranteeing that divine beings received the worship and sustenance they required. He appointed high priests and priestesses, often from his own family, maintaining control over religious institutions while honouring their sacred character. In exchange, the priests proclaimed divine approval for the king's rule, performed rituals ensuring his success in war and peace, interpreted omens favourably when politically convenient, and used their religious authority to reinforce political hierarchies and justify existing power structures. Part 8. The Quest for Immortality. To prove this point, Utnapishtim challenges Gilgamesh to stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights. A test that seems simple compared to the extraordinary feats Gilgamesh has already accomplished in reaching this remote location at the edge of the world. But Gilgamesh fails immediately, overwhelmed by exhaustion from his long journey. He falls asleep almost as soon as he sits down, and sleeps for 7 days straight while Utnapishtim's wife bakes a loaf of bread each day to mark the passage of time, creating evidence that will prove to Gilgamesh how long he has slept. When Gilgamesh finally awakens and claims he only dozed for a moment, Utnapishtim points to the 7 loaves, the first one mouldy and ancient, the last one still fresh from the oven, demonstrating that 7 full days have passed. The message is devastatingly clear. If Gilgamesh cannot even conquer sleep, that little death that comes each night, how can he hope to conquer actual death itself? Mortality is woven into his very nature, inescapable and absolute. However, moved by compassion for this heroic but doomed king, Utnapishtim reveals one final secret: a plant that grows at the bottom of the cosmic ocean, a magical herb that can restore youth, though not grant immortality. It won't make Gilgamesh live forever, but it will allow him to be young again, to regain the vigour and strength of his prime. Gilgamesh dives to the ocean floor, retrieves this precious plant, and begins the long journey back to Uruk, planning to test the plant on an old man in his city before using it himself, demonstrating the wisdom and caution befitting a true king who thinks of his people. But on the way home, while Gilgamesh bathes in a cool pool to refresh himself from travel, a serpent smells the plant's sweet fragrance, emerges from the water, and steals it, slithering away into the reeds. The snake immediately sheds its skin, becoming young again, which is why snakes can renew themselves by shedding their old skin, while humans cannot. Gilgamesh sits down and weeps, recognizing the cosmic irony and the ultimate futility of his quest. Everything he has endured, all the impossible obstacles he has overcome, every danger he has faced, all of it has been for nothing. Immortality remains beyond human reach. Even renewed youth has been denied him through a moment of carelessness. The meaning of mortality, the epic concludes with Gilgamesh returning to Uruk, no longer seeking to escape death, but accepting his mortality and finding meaning in his mortal accomplishments. He shows his companion the walls of Uruk, massive fortifications he built to protect his people, monuments that will endure long after his death. He speaks of the temples he constructed, the canals he dug, the prosperity he brought to his city through wise governance and successful military campaigns. These achievements, the epic suggests, are the only immortality available to mortals. We cannot live forever as individuals, but we can create works that outlast us, build institutions that serve future generations, contribute to civilization in ways that echo through time. This is a profoundly humanistic conclusion for an ancient text, one that anticipates by millennia the existentialist philosophy of creating meaning in a universe that offers no inherent purpose or immortal reward. The Gilgamesh tradition, existing in Sumerian versions from the early 3rd millennium BCE and later expanded and refined in Akkadian versions, represents humanity's first extended literary meditation on death, friendship, the limits of power, and the search for meaning in a finite existence. It deserves recognition as one of the foundational texts of world literature, standing alongside Homer and the Hebrew Bible as a source from which later literary traditions would draw inspiration and themes. Part 9. Divine Healing and Medical Knowledge. Before we continue deeper into Sumerian civilization, we must examine an aspect often overlooked but fundamental to their understanding of divine order: healing arts and medical knowledge. The Sumerians understood disease not as a purely biological phenomenon arising from natural causes that could be treated with natural remedies. Disease was for them a sign of disturbed cosmic order, an intrusion of chaos into the orderly world, evidence that something had gone wrong in the relationship between divine and mortal realms. Illness could result from several causes, according to Sumerian medical texts that have survived on clay tablets from temple archives and private collections. Divine punishment for offences against the gods, violations of ritual requirements, failures to make proper offerings, disrespect shown to sacred spaces or objects. The gods could strike down mortals who angered them, sending disease as direct punishment for transgressions. Demonic possession by malevolent spirits who entered the body and caused suffering. Beings from the chaotic realm beyond civilized order, who took advantage of weakness or vulnerability to afflict humans with various ailments. These demons had names and specific characteristics, each associated with particular symptoms and requiring specific countermeasures. Sorcery performed by enemies who used magical techniques to curse their victims, a belief that reflects the Sumerian understanding that words and rituals had real power to affect reality, that properly performed magic could cause harm across distances, that human malice could manifest as physical disease through supernatural means. Natural causes like bad food or contaminated water, though even these natural explanations were understood within a theological framework where the gods controlled natural processes and nothing happened purely by chance without divine involvement or permission. The healing goddess, Gula. The primary deity associated with healing was Gula, also known by names including Ninisina, Ninkarak, and Bao in different cities and periods. She was called the Great Physician, the divine healer who possessed knowledge of all cures, who could restore health to the sick and injured. Gula was associated with dogs, those animals who often appear in Mesopotamian art alongside this goddess. Dogs were sacred to her, partly because they were observed licking their wounds, which seemed to promote healing, a behaviour that suggested these animals possessed instinctive medical knowledge. Her temple at Izin, a city in central Mesopotamia that became particularly important during the early 2nd millennium BCE, served as a healing centre where priests trained in medical arts treated patients using combinations of herbal remedies, surgical procedures, magical incantations, and religious rituals. The medical texts that survive from ancient Mesopotamia, and we have hundreds of tablets dealing with diagnosis and treatment, reveal a sophisticated system that combined empirical observation with theological interpretation. They describe symptoms with remarkable precision. Fever that comes and goes in cycles, chest pains that radiate to the arm, yellowing of the skin indicating liver problems, changes in urine colour or consistency suggesting various ailments. This diagnostic accuracy demonstrates genuine medical observation and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of healers. But the treatments prescribed typically combined practical remedies with magical procedures. Apply this herbal poultice to the wound while reciting this incantation to drive away demons. Drink this medicinal tea while wearing this protective amulet inscribed with divine names. Undergo this surgical procedure while priests perform rituals to ensure the goddess Gula guides the physician's hand. This integrated approach, treating both the physical symptoms and the spiritual causes, made perfect sense within Sumerian cosmology, where physical and spiritual realms interpenetrated, where you couldn't truly heal the body without addressing the cosmic disorder that had allowed disease to manifest. Medical training and professional healers. Two types of medical practitioners operated in Sumerian society, each with distinct training, methods, and social status. The ASU, or physician, focused primarily on practical treatments. Herbal remedies prepared according to traditional recipes. Surgical procedures for treating wounds and setting broken bones. Dietary recommendations for various conditions. These practitioners were closest to what we would recognize as doctors in the modern sense, though they still operated within the theological framework of their culture. The Azipu, or exorcist priest, specialized in magical and religious treatments, performing rituals to drive out demons, reciting incantations to appease angry gods, creating amulets and talismans to protect patients from supernatural harm, interpreting the spiritual causes behind physical symptoms through divination. Both types of healers were necessary for comprehensive treatment. A patient might consult a physician for herbal remedies and wound care while also engaging an exorcist to determine which god had been offended or which demon needed to be expelled. Medical training took place primarily in temple schools, where young scribes learned to read the complex cuneiform script and studied the diagnostic and therapeutic texts that had been accumulated over centuries. These student physicians copied ancient medical tablets as part of their training, preserving traditional knowledge while sometimes adding new observations from their own experience or from their teacher's practice. This process of transmission created a living medical tradition that evolved gradually while maintaining continuity with ancient wisdom. The Pharmacopoeia Sumerian and later Babylonian medical texts describe hundreds of substances used for healing purposes, drawn from the mineral, plant, and animal kingdoms. Minerals including salt used for cleansing wounds, alum as an astringent to stop bleeding, sulfur compounds for skin conditions, various types of earth and clay applied as poultices, plants including willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, for pain and fever, poppy derivatives for severe pain, cannabis for various ailments, garlic for infections, mint for digestive problems, dates and figs for nutritional support, dozens of herbs whose ancient Sumerian or Akkadian names cannot always be confidently matched to modern botanical classifications, animal products including honey for wound dressing, now known to have genuine antibacterial properties, milk and butter for various preparations, bile and other organ extracts, even crushed insects for certain conditions. These substances were prepared through various methods: boiling to extract active ingredients, grinding to powder for easier administration, mixing with beer or wine to create medicinal drinks, combining with fats to make ointments and salves. The sophistication of this pharmacological knowledge shouldn't be underestimated. While the Sumerians didn't understand biochemistry or have microscopes to observe bacteria and viruses, they had accumulated through centuries of trial and error a genuine body of effective treatments for many conditions. Modern pharmacological research has sometimes vindicated ancient remedies, finding that substances used in Mesopotamian medicine do indeed contain compounds with therapeutic effects. Part 10. The Sacred Marriage and Fertility Rituals. Among the most important and controversial rituals in Sumerian religious practice was the sacred marriage, a ceremony performed annually in major cities to ensure agricultural fertility, to renew cosmic vitality, to maintain the prosperity that civilization depended upon. This ritual involved the symbolic or perhaps actual sexual union between the king and a high priestess representing the goddess Inanna, reenacting the mythological marriage between Inanna and her consort Dumuzi, whose love and whose tragic separation and reunion mirrored the agricultural cycle of growth and dormancy. The sacred marriage took place during the New Year festival, that crucial time when the old year ended and the new year began, when the fates for the coming year were determined by divine decree, when the cosmic order needed to be renewed and revitalized through ritual action. Texts describing this ceremony have survived from multiple Sumerian cities, particularly from Uruk, where Inanna was the patron deity, and these compositions provide fascinating glimpses into the theological meaning and practical performance of this most intimate religious rite. The ritual began with elaborate preparations. The construction of a special bridal chamber decorated with precious materials, cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, silver and gold, fine textiles and sweet-smelling oils. The king, representing the shepherd god Dumuzi, underwent ritual purification and dressed in special garments befitting a divine bridegroom. The high priestess, embodying Inanna herself, adorned herself with the goddess's regalia: crown and jewelry, perfumes and cosmetics, garments that transformed her from a human woman into the living incarnation of divine femininity. The ceremony progressed through stages marked by hymns and prayers, ritual actions and processions, building toward the climactic moment of union in the bridal chamber, the love songs of Inanna and Dumuzi. Remarkable poetic compositions have survived that were apparently sung or recited during the sacred marriage ceremony, some of the most beautiful and explicitly erotic literature from the ancient world. These texts speak in the voice of Inanna, praising her beloved. My vulva, the horn, the boat of heaven, is full of eagerness, like the young moon. My untilled land lies fallow. As for me, Inanna, who will plough my vulva? Who will plough my high field? Who will plough my wet ground? And Dumuzi responds, Great lady, the king will plough your vulva. I, Dumuzi the king, will plough your vulva. The frankness of this imagery, the explicit celebration of sexuality as sacred rather than shameful, reflects a theological understanding that physical fertility and cosmic fertility were intimately connected, that the generative power creating new life in the fields was the same power creating new life in human bodies. The union of king and priestess in the sacred marriage wasn't seen as metaphorical or symbolic only. It was understood as truly bringing divine power into the mortal realm, as channeling the creative energy of Inanna and Dumuzi through their human representatives, as ensuring that this divine fecundity would overflow into the natural world, causing crops to grow and animals to multiply and the city to prosper. Scholarly debates. Modern scholars have debated extensively whether the sacred marriage involved actual sexual intercourse between the king and priestess, or whether it was purely symbolic, a ritual enactment that stopped short of physical consummation. The explicit language of the texts certainly suggests physical union, and some scholars argue that in the context of Sumerian religious practice, where the boundary between symbol and reality was much less absolute than in modern thought, ritual action was understood as genuinely bringing about what it represented. Others contend that the metaphorical and poetic nature of ancient religious language makes it impossible to determine from texts alone what physically occurred, that we cannot simply read these hymns as literal descriptions of events. What remains clear, regardless of the debate about physical details, is the theological principle underlying the ritual. Fertility, agricultural, animal, and human, was not automatic or guaranteed, but required divine blessing, needed to be ritually renewed each year through proper ceremony that connected earth to heaven, mortal to divine, human sexuality to cosmic creativity. The descent of Inanna, the sacred marriage cycle, was connected to another crucial narrative in Sumerian mythology. Inanna's descent to the underworld, her death and resurrection, a story that enacted the annual cycle of agricultural dormancy and renewal. We touched on this narrative earlier when discussing the Anunnaki as judges, but it deserves fuller examination because it represents one of the most powerful and complex mythological compositions from ancient Mesopotamia. The story begins with Inanna deciding to descend to the underworld to attend the funeral rites of Gilgamesh, the bull of heaven, who had been the husband of her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. This decision to visit the realm of the dead was extraordinarily dangerous for several reasons. The underworld was the one place where Inanna's power didn't extend, where different rules applied, where even the greatest goddess could be trapped and destroyed. But Inanna went anyway, driven by curiosity or family obligation, or perhaps by some deeper cosmic necessity that required her to make this journey into darkness. Before descending, she instructed her faithful minister Ninshubur on what to do if she didn't return. Wait 3 days, then go to the great gods and plead for help rescuing her from the underworld. Inanna then began her descent through the 7 gates of the underworld, each gate guarded by a gatekeeper who demanded she surrender an item of her divine power as payment for passage. At the first gate, she removed her crown, symbol of her sovereignty. At the second, her lapis lazuli necklace. At the third, the small lapis beads from around her neck. At the fourth, her breastplate. At the fifth, her golden ring. At the sixth, her lapis measuring rod and line. At the seventh and final gate, her royal robe. This progressive stripping represented the removal of divine power and protection, the reduction of the goddess from her exalted state to naked vulnerability. With each item removed, Inanna became less divine, more exposed to the dangers of the underworld realm. She arrived before Ereshkigal's throne completely naked and powerless, no longer the glorious queen of heaven and earth, but vulnerable as any mortal entering the land of the dead. Ereshkigal and the Anunnaki. Ereshkigal, her sister and queen of the underworld, sat in judgment along with the 7 Anunnaki judges we discussed earlier, those divine authorities whose power in the underworld was absolute. The reasons for what happened next are not entirely clear in the texts that have survived. Some versions suggest Ereshkigal was jealous of her sister's beauty and power. Others hint at deeper cosmic necessities that required Inanna to undergo this ordeal. The Anunnaki fastened their eyes of death upon Inanna, that terrible gaze that strips away immortality, that kills even divine beings when they enter this realm where death holds supreme authority. Inanna died under their gaze. Her body turned into a corpse that was hung on a hook like a piece of meat left to rot. For 3 days and 3 nights she remained dead, her absence from the upper world causing all fertility and growth to cease. Ninshubur, following the instructions Inanna had given before descending, went to the great gods pleading for help. Enlil refused, saying Inanna had brought this fate upon herself by descending to the underworld. Nanna, the moon god, and Inanna's father, also refused to help. Finally, Ninshubur came to Enki, that wise and compassionate god who so often came to humanity's aid, and Enki agreed to rescue Inanna. He created 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, genderless creatures who could slip past the guardians of the underworld because they were neither fully alive nor fully dead, neither male nor female, belonging to no category that the underworld authorities recognized and could stop. These creatures descended to the underworld and found Ereshkigal in the midst of childbirth, moaning in pain like a woman in labour. They sympathized with her suffering, groaning along with her, showing compassion for the queen of the dead, whom no one else pitied. Moved by their sympathy, Ereshkigal offered them a gift, anything they desired. They asked for the corpse of Inanna hanging on the hook. Ereshkigal, bound by her word, had to give them what they requested. The creatures sprinkled the food of life and the water of life that Enki had given them onto Inanna's corpse, and she revived, returning to life from death itself. The price of return? But returning from the underworld wasn't so simple. An ancient law required that no one could leave the land of the dead without providing a substitute. Someone to take their place in that grim realm. Someone to die so they could live. Demons called Gala accompanied Inanna as she ascended back to the upper world, tasked with seizing whoever she designated as her replacement. Inanna found her minister, Ninshubur, dressed in mourning clothes, grieving for her lost goddess. The demons moved to take Ninshubur, but Inanna refused to let them, saying this faithful servant who had worked so hard to save her could not be the substitute. She found her sons, also mourning and dressed in rags. Again the demons moved to take them, and again Inanna refused, protecting her children from the fate of death. Finally she arrived at her city of Uruk and found her husband Dumuzi sitting on a magnificent throne, dressed in fine clothes, apparently celebrating rather than mourning her absence. Enraged by what she perceived as his indifference to her death, Inanna pointed at Dumuzi and designated him as her substitute. The demons seized him, despite his pleas for mercy, and dragged him down to the underworld to take Inanna's place. The resolution but Dumuzi's sister, Inanna, who loved her brother dearly, volunteered to share his fate. The final resolution, which appears in some versions of the myth but not others, was that Dumuzi and Inanna would each spend half the year in the underworld, alternating so that one was always dead while the other lived. When Dumuzi was in the underworld, the earth became barren. Crops withered. Animals stopped breeding. Fertility departed from the world. This was the dormant season, the time of death when life retreated underground. When Dumuzi returned to the upper world and reunited with Inanna in the sacred marriage, fertility returned. Crops grew, animals multiplied, life flourished again. This was the growing season, the time of life and abundance. This mythological cycle provided theological explanation for the agricultural year, making sense of why fertility wasn't constant, but followed annual patterns of growth and dormancy, abundance and scarcity. The myth also addressed profound existential questions about the nature of love and death, about the price of life, about the necessity of sacrifice and substitution, about whether anyone can truly escape death, or whether we all simply defer it by passing it to another. The first and greatest of these sages was named Adapa, who served as priest to Enki in the sacred city of Eridu during the antediluvian age, when gods and humans lived in closer proximity than would be possible after the flood. Adapa possessed perfect wisdom, having been endowed by Enki with comprehensive understanding of all crafts and techniques necessary for civilized life. He knew agriculture and irrigation, construction and metalworking, fishing and navigation, ritual and magic, every skill that elevated humans above animal existence. The story of Adapa. A famous myth describes how Adapa accidentally broke the wing of the south wind while fishing in the waters near Eridu, causing the wind to stop blowing for 7 days and disrupting the cosmic order. This offence against the natural order came to the attention of Anu in his heavenly realm, and Adapa was summoned to the celestial court to answer for his actions. Enki, concerned for his faithful priest, warned Adapa about what to expect. He would be offered the bread of life and the water of life, and he must refuse them because they were actually the bread of death and the water of death that would kill him rather than granting immortality. This was strange advice whose purpose wasn't immediately clear. Why would Anu offer death to Adapa disguised as life? But Enki insisted, and Adapa trusted his divine patron's wisdom. When Adapa arrived in heaven and stood before Anu's throne, the sky god was actually pleased with this wise mortal who had served Enki so faithfully. Rather than punishing Adapa, Anu decided to reward him by offering him immortality, the bread of life and the water of life that would transform him from mortal to divine, allowing him to live forever among the gods. But Adapa, following Enki's instructions, refused the offered food and drink. Anu was confused and perhaps insulted by this refusal of his generous gift. He asked why Adapa wouldn't accept immortality, and the sage explained that his master Enki had warned him the food and drink were actually deadly. Anu realized what had happened. Enki, not wanting to lose his best priest to the heavenly realm, had deliberately deceived Adapa, causing him to refuse the gift of eternal life through trickery. There are different interpretations of Enki's motivation in various scholarly analyses. Perhaps he genuinely believed Anu intended to poison Adapa and was protecting him, or perhaps he selfishly wanted to keep Adapa in his service rather than losing him to the celestial realm, or perhaps there was some deeper cosmic reason why humanity should remain mortal rather than achieving divine status. Regardless of motivation, the result was the same. Adapa returned to Earth still mortal, having refused the one chance for a human to escape death, and join the gods permanently in their immortal existence. This story provided theological explanation for human mortality, not as punishment for sin, as in the biblical tradition, but as the result of deception and missed opportunity. A cosmic tragedy resulting from miscommunication between divine beings who didn't fully understand each other's intentions. The Apkallu tradition. The 7 Apkallu were credited with establishing the fundamental institutions of Sumerian civilization during the generations before the flood. They taught agriculture, how to select and plant seeds, when to irrigate, how to harvest and store grain, how to breed better varieties of wheat and barley. They revealed the arts of building in mud brick, how to make bricks from clay and straw, how to construct walls that would stand for generations, how to build temples that connected earth to heaven. They transmitted knowledge of irrigation engineering, how to dig canals that brought water from rivers to distant fields, how to build levees that protected cities from floods, how to distribute water fairly among many users. They instructed humans in metalworking, how to extract copper from ore, how to alloy copper with tin to create harder bronze, how to cast and forge tools and weapons. They taught writing, that revolutionary technology that allowed knowledge to be preserved beyond the memories of individual sages, that made possible the administration of complex institutions and the recording of laws and literature. They revealed magical and medical knowledge, incantations that could heal diseases or protect from harm, herbal remedies for various ailments, ritual procedures for communicating with the divine realm. Each of the 7 sages was associated with one of the antediluvian cities we discussed earlier, serving as the primary teacher and civilizer for that urban centre, establishing the patterns that would be maintained after the flood. After the deluge destroyed the antediluvian world, the Apkallu disappeared, returning to the divine realm, or perhaps perishing in the flood waters. No more such beings would be sent to teach humanity directly. Instead, human sages would arise, wise men and women who studied the knowledge the Apkallu had taught, who preserved and transmitted this ancient wisdom through the generations, who added their own discoveries and insights to the accumulating tradition. But these human sages lacked the perfect wisdom of the Apkallu, were prone to errors and limitations that the antediluvian teachers had transcended. The post-flood world was a diminished age, cut off from the direct divine instruction that had characterized the golden age before the catastrophe.